The Millionaire CEO was dining with his fiancée when two little girls walked up and said, "You're our dad." On the top floor of the Meridian Crown, where floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the glittering skyline of Manhattan, every table had been reserved weeks in advance. It wasn't the kind of place people visited on impulse. Birthdays were celebrated there. Anniversaries were remembered there. Lives quietly changed there. Tonight, one table had become the center of Silas Thornfield's universe. He barely noticed the skyline stretching beyond the windows. He barely heard the soft piano drifting through the room or the laughter from nearby tables. His attention never wandered far from the woman across from him. Marigold Brandon smiled as she folded the dinner menu shut. "So," she teased, tilting her head, "you've checked your watch 4 times in the last 10 minutes. Silas looked down at his wrist. "I have? You just did it again." He chuckled under his breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I'm a little distracted." "A little?" She laughed. "I've seen you negotiate billion-dollar mergers without blinking. Tonight you look like you're about to take your driving test." He smiled, grateful she hadn't guessed the real reason. Not yet. For 3 weeks, a small velvet box had traveled everywhere with him. Board meetings, private flights, charity dinners, even morning walks. Every day he'd convinced himself tomorrow would be the perfect moment. Until finally, tomorrow had become tonight. Their dinner arrived, but neither of them paid much attention to the beautifully prepared plates. Marigold noticed Silas wasn't eating. "You're making me nervous now." "I was hoping not to. Should I be worried?" He smiled warmly. "Quite the opposite." The pianist, as if sensing something special was about to happen, eased into a slower melody. A nearby couple looked over with knowing smiles. Even one of the waiters quietly stepped back, giving them a little more space. Silas took one slow breath. His heartbeat refused to cooperate. He reached inside his jacket. His fingertips found the velvet box immediately. Marigold's eyes followed his hand. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. "Oh." Her voice became barely more than a whisper. Silas stood from his chair. Several conversations nearby faded as curious guests glanced toward them. He held the box gently, opened it. The diamond caught the light. His eyes met hers. Marigold. Before another word could leave his mouth, the restaurant's front entrance flew open with enough force to make every head turn. 2 little girls, no older than 6, hurried inside. Their matching cream-colored sweaters were slightly wrinkled, as though they'd been searching all evening. One clutched a tiny stuffed rabbit. The other held her sister's hand so tightly their fingers had turned pale. They scanned the room with determined little faces. One whispered, "Do you see him?" The other nodded. "I think." Then both froze. Their eyes locked onto Silas. "There he is!" Before anyone understood what was happening, Jessica and Meadow darted between tables. The server instinctively stepped aside. Guests turned in their chairs. Someone quietly lowered their phone. The sisters reached Silas almost at the same moment. "Daddy!" Meadow threw both arms around his waist. Jessica hugged his arm with absolute certainty. Silas didn't move. His eyes widened in complete disbelief. "I'm sorry." He looked from one child to the other. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." Jessica frowned. "No, you are him." Marigold slowly rose from her chair. She didn't accuse him. She didn't panic. She simply looked from the girls to Silas, waiting for an explanation he clearly didn't have. Jessica carefully reached into the pocket of her little sweater. She unfolded an old photograph that had been bent and straightened so many times the edges had become soft. Without saying another word, she placed it into Silas's hand. His fingers closed around it automatically. The instant his eyes landed on the image, every trace of color left his face. His breathing became uneven. The room around him disappeared. Marigold stepped closer. "Silas." He couldn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph. His hand trembled. Jessica looked up hopefully. "I told Meadow you'd remember." Silas swallowed hard. Whatever he had just seen, it belonged to a chapter of his life he had believed was gone forever. The audience still doesn't see the photograph, only Silas's reaction. And somehow, that reaction says everything. If you're enjoying stories filled with unexpected twists, heartfelt moments, and characters whose choices stay with you long after the ending, you're in exactly the right place. Welcome to Mr. Williams Storytime. Take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from. It truly helps the channel grow and allows more people to discover stories like this one. Now, keep watching, because the woman in that photograph disappeared 7 years ago, and in just a few seconds, she's about to walk back into Silas Thornfield's life. Nobody inside the restaurant returned to their meal. Forks rested untouched. Quiet conversations stopped without anyone asking, Jessica and Meadow never let go of Silas. Marigold searched his face. She wasn't looking for guilt. She was looking for recognition. Silas finally managed to whisper, "Who are you?" Jessica smiled as though the answer were obvious. "We've been looking for you." Meadow nodded eagerly. "Mom said someday we'd find you." Silas frowned. "I've never met either of you." The girls exchanged puzzled looks. For the first time, they seemed confused too. Near the front entrance, a woman stood motionless. She hadn't rushed inside with the girls. She had waited, giving them the chance to find the man they'd spent years hearing about. Her hand tightened around the strap of her worn leather handbag. She watched Silas from across the room. 7 years had changed almost everything. His tailored suit, his confidence, the silver at his temples. But one thing hadn't changed: the kindness in his eyes. She drew a slow breath. It was finally time. Jessica turned toward the entrance. A bright smile spread across her face. "Mom!" Meadow looked over too. "We found him!" Every person in the room followed their gaze. Marigold turned last. Silas slowly lifted his head. For one impossible moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. 7 years of unanswered questions stood between them. The woman took one steady step forward. Her eyes never left Silas. A faint smile appeared, though it carried years of quiet heartache. Then she spoke. "Hello, Silas." The diamond ring remained open in his hand. Jessica and Meadow stood beside him. Marigold waited for answers, and Silas realized the future he'd carefully planned had just collided with the past he had never truly left behind. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Silas stared across the restaurant, unable to convince himself he wasn't imagining what he was seeing. The woman standing near the entrance looked different from the last time he'd seen her. Her dark hair was shorter now, resting just above her shoulders. Fine lines at the corners of her eyes hinted at years spent carrying responsibilities instead of dreams. She wore a simple navy coat that looked practical rather than fashionable, and there was nothing about her appearance that suggested she had come looking for attention. Yet she somehow commanded the entire room. "Hello, Silas." Her voice was gentle, almost careful, as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile bridge had brought them face to face again. Silas could barely breathe. "Juniper." It was little more than a whisper. Marigold slowly looked from Silas to the woman standing several yards away. "You know her?" It wasn't a question. Silas nodded without taking his eyes off Juniper. "I do." Jessica and Meadow immediately ran toward their mother. "We found him," Meadow said proudly. "We told you he was here," Jessica added. Juniper smiled at the girls before returning her attention to Silas. "You did exactly what I asked." The twins beamed. For them, tonight felt like the end of a long adventure. For the adults, it felt like the beginning of something none of them understood. The restaurant had grown so quiet that the soft clink of a glass being set onto a nearby table sounded unusually loud. People weren't pretending not to watch anymore. Every eye in the room followed the strange reunion unfolding in front of them. One man lowered the menu he hadn't looked at in several minutes. A couple celebrating an anniversary exchanged puzzled glances. Even the pianist had stopped playing altogether. Marigold finally stepped beside Silas. She kept her voice calm. "Would someone please tell me what's happening?" Silas looked at her, searching for the right words. "I wish I could." Juniper lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." Marigold frowned slightly. "Sorry for what?" "For walking into your evening like this." Silas finally found his voice. "What are you doing here?" Juniper answered honestly. "I didn't plan for this." Jessica looked confused. "But you said we'd find him." "I said we'd look. I didn't know tonight would be the night." Silas stared at the twins. "They've been looking for me?" Juniper nodded once. "For a long time." The restaurant manager approached carefully, clearly unsure whether he should interrupt. "Mr. Thornfield," Silas turned toward him. "If you'd like some privacy, we have a private dining suite available." Silas glanced toward Marigold, then Juniper, then the twins. He nodded. "I think that would be best." Within moments, they were led through a quiet hallway toward an elegant room overlooking the city. Once the door closed behind them, the silence somehow became heavier. Jessica climbed into one of the chairs. Meadow remained close to Juniper, gently holding her mother's hand. Marigold stayed standing. Silas remained near the window, trying to make sense of the last 5 minutes. Finally, Marigold broke the silence. "I deserve to know who she is." Silas looked toward Juniper. She gave a small nod. He drew one slow breath. "Her name is Juniper." Another pause. "She was." He stopped. The words felt heavier than expected. "The woman I plan to spend my life with." Marigold didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Silas looked down at the photograph still resting in his hand. I met her when neither of us had much of anything. Juniper smiled faintly. We thought $20 was enough for a perfect weekend. Silas couldn't help smiling. It usually was. Jessica leaned forward with curiosity. You were funny back then? Juniper laughed softly. He was terrible at telling jokes. I disagree. You once spent 10 minutes trying to convince me pigeons secretly worked for the government. I was experimenting. You were losing an argument. Even Marigold smiled despite herself. For the first time since Juniper had arrived, the tension eased just enough for everyone to remember they were talking about real people, not strangers, not enemies, people who had once loved each other very deeply. Marigold finally looked directly at Juniper. If the two of you were once together, she hesitated. Why did you disappear? Juniper's expression changed immediately. The small smile vanished. She looked down at her folded hands. I've asked myself that same question every day for 7 years. Silas looked at her carefully. You left without a word. I know. I waited. I know. I called. I know. His voice remained calm. So why? Juniper looked up. Tears had begun gathering in her eyes. I wanted to tell you. I tried. She couldn't finish. Not yet. Adults often believe children missed complicated emotions. Jessica proved otherwise. She quietly looked around the room. At Silas, at Juniper, at Marigold. Then she gently touched Meadow's shoulder. They're hurting. Meadow nodded. I know. Jessica leaned closer. Maybe this wasn't the right time. Juniper overheard them. She reached across the table and squeezed Jessica's hand. No, her voice was quiet. It became the right time the moment we walked through those doors. Silas looked toward the little girl. Jessica reminded him of someone. Thoughtful, careful, always watching before speaking. He couldn't explain why, but something about her felt strangely familiar. Silas slowly placed the photograph onto the table. I don't want half the truth. Juniper nodded. You won't get half. I don't want excuses. I won't make any. I just want honesty. She met his eyes. For the first time in 7 years. You'll have it. The room became still again. Marigold quietly pulled out a chair and sat down. Whatever story was about to unfold, she wanted to hear every word. A server entered carrying hot chocolate for Jessica and Meadow. Neither girl touched it. Meadow looked toward Juniper. Can we tell him now? Juniper smiled sadly. Almost. Jessica looked at Silas. You're going to understand. Silas managed a small smile. I hope so. Jessica nodded with complete confidence. You will. Silas wished he shared her certainty. Juniper slowly reached into her handbag. Not for another photograph. Not for a letter. For something much smaller. A worn envelope. The edges had faded with age. She carefully placed it on the table between herself and Silas. Across the front, written in handwriting he would recognize anywhere, were 2 words that made his heart stop. To Silas. He stared at it in silence, then looked back at Juniper. She swallowed. I wrote that the day I disappeared. Silas reached toward the envelope, just as the story of the last 7 years was finally about to begin. Silas looked at the faded envelope for several seconds before touching it. His fingertips brushed across his own name, written in handwriting he hadn't seen in 7 years. He looked at Juniper. You kept this? She nodded. I kept all of them. All of them. There were 43. Marigold frowned. 43? Juniper slowly reached into her handbag again. This time she removed a bundle of envelopes tied together with a worn blue ribbon. Each one carried the same address. Each one carried the same handwriting. Each one had been returned. Silas stared in disbelief. I never received these. I know. I would have answered. I know. You really wrote all of these? Juniper smiled sadly. I wrote whenever I missed you. She gently untied the ribbon. The first one was written the morning after I couldn't reach the station. Silas carefully opened it. His eyes moved across the page. His breathing slowed. The room disappeared once again. The words carried him back to another life, a much smaller one, back when Silas still drove an old pickup truck that rattled every time it stopped at a red light, back when Friday nights meant grabbing cheeseburgers from a roadside diner because neither of them could afford expensive restaurants. Juniper laughed quietly. You still remember that truck? I remember you making fun of it. It deserved it. It had character. It had rust. Jessica giggled. What color was it? Silas smiled. Blue. Juniper immediately corrected him. It was supposed to be blue. It had become several colors. Everyone laughed. Even Marigold. For the first time since the evening had begun, the room felt warmer. Not because of romance, because genuine memories had a way of making strangers feel like old friends. Silas folded the letter carefully. You made ordinary days feel important. Juniper lowered her eyes. So did you. We had everything figured out, Silas said quietly. Jessica looked surprised. You did? Oh, absolutely. Juniper laughed. We planned a whole future with almost no money. Silas nodded. We picked out a house we couldn't afford. We argued over paint colors. You wanted yellow. You wanted gray. It was elegant. It was depressing. Jessica looked horrified. You argued about paint? Marigold smiled. That's usually a good sign. Meadow tilted her head. Why? Because people don't argue about little things unless they expect to stay together. The twins thought about that. It makes sense, Jessica admitted. Silas looked toward Juniper. We even picked baby names. Juniper smiled softly. You wanted 3 children. You wanted 2. I was negotiating. You were losing. The laughter faded naturally. Silas looked down again. We really thought nothing could separate us. Juniper's smile slowly disappeared. So did I. Silas leaned back in his chair. I still remember the morning my company asked me to move to New York. Juniper nodded. So do I. I asked you to come. You did. You said yes. I meant it. Marigold listened without interrupting. There wasn't bitterness in either voice. Only regret. Juniper clasped her hands together. 3 days later, my mother collapsed. Silas frowned. You told me she wasn't feeling well. I thought it was exhaustion. She looked down. It wasn't. Jessica quietly reached for her mother's hand. The doctors found the cancer. Silas closed his eyes. You never told me. I tried. I called. I wrote. I even drove to your apartment. Silas looked up sharply. You did? No one was there. I had already left for New York. I know now. Silas let out a slow breath. They had both been searching, just never at the same place. Juniper gently pushed the bundle of letters toward him. I stopped counting after 30. So why keep writing? She answered without hesitation. Because it was the only conversation I still had with you. Silas looked down at the envelopes. Everyone represented a day she had refused to stop hoping. Marigold quietly asked, what made them come back? Juniper picked up one envelope. Across the front, stamped in bright red ink, were 3 painful words. Return to sender. Silas stared. I changed office buildings after the company expanded. I didn't know. Oh, I thought. He stopped. Juniper smiled sadly. I know what you thought. He looked at her. I thought you'd stopped loving me. A tear slipped down Juniper's cheek. I believed exactly the same thing. No betrayal, no lies, no affair. Just 2 people separated by timing and years of silence that neither of them had chosen. The room remained silent. Marigold slowly leaned back in her chair. She had spent the last hour expecting to discover some terrible secret. Instead, she had found heartbreak, not deception. She looked at Juniper. I'm sorry. Juniper blinked. You don't owe me an apology. No. Marigold shook her head gently. But I'm sorry for what life did to both of you. Silas looked toward her. You aren't angry? She smiled faintly. At who? You. You didn't know, Juniper. She tried. She folded her hands together. The only thing I'm angry at is 7 years that none of you can ever get back. Juniper looked at her with genuine gratitude. I understand why he loves you. Marigold smiled politely. And I understand why he never forgot you. There was no jealousy between them, only respect. Jessica had remained unusually quiet. She watched Silas more carefully than anyone realized. Finally, she asked, Can I ask something? Silas smiled. Of course. She pointed toward the letters. If Mommy loved you, and you loved Mommy, why didn't either of you keep looking? Silas opened his mouth, then stopped, because he didn't have an answer. Juniper answered first. Sometimes. Jessica come tired of hoping. Jessica thought about that. I don't think I would have stopped. Neither adult knew how to answer. Children had a way of making complicated things sound painfully simple. Silas unfolded another letter. A small pressed daisy fell onto the table. He smiled immediately. You kept it. Juniper laughed softly through her tears. You remember? You picked it beside the lake. You said wildflowers survived because nobody expected them to. Silas carefully picked up the tiny flower. I told you we'd come back every spring. We never did. No. He looked toward the window. We never got the chance. Juniper quietly answered. I used to go anyway. Silas looked back at her. Every year? She nodded once. Just in case. His eyes lowered. He didn't trust himself to speak. The room fell quiet once more. Then Meadow looked at Silas with complete innocence. I still don't understand. Silas smiled gently. What don't you understand? If Mommy loved you, why did you marry my dad instead? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Silas slowly turned toward Juniper. Marigold looked at Mitchell's empty chair. Jessica lowered her eyes. Juniper drew a careful breath, then whispered, That's the hardest part of the story. Meadow quietly asked, If you loved each other, what happened? The question settled gently over the room. Silas looked at Juniper. Juniper looked back at him. Neither of them spoke, not immediately. Finally, Juniper managed a small, wistful smile. Life kept moving. No one interrupted. I stayed behind to take care of my mother. Her voice remained calm. Time passed. She folded her hands together. I eventually met someone else. A quiet pause followed. And years went by. That was all she said. No names, no details, no explanations. Just enough truth to answer the question, without opening every door behind it. Marigold noticed it immediately. Juniper wasn't lying, but she was carefully choosing where the story stopped. Silas noticed it too. He recognized the look in her eyes. There were chapters she wasn't ready to revisit. He didn't push. Not tonight. Marigold offered a gentle smile. When you're ready. Juniper nodded gratefully. I will. Jessica suddenly leaned toward Silas. Can I ask you something? He smiled. Of course. Did you really save a dog from a frozen lake? Silas blinked. What? Meadow smiled. Or was Mommy making that one up? Silas laughed. I've never rescued a dog. Juniper laughed for the first time all evening. A genuine laugh. I may have improved that story. Jessica grinned. I knew it. Then she started counting stories on her fingers. The elderly woman whose groceries were too heavy. Silas nodded. That happened. The winter coats. That happened too. The broken porch. Silas smiled. I repaired a few loose boards. Jessica folded her arms proudly. I told Meadow they were real. Meadow giggled. I thought maybe some of them were. Juniper smiled warmly. The important part was never whether every little detail was perfect. Silas looked at her. It wasn't? She shook her head. The important part was showing them that kindness exists. Jessica nodded. Mom never told us fairy tales. She told us stories about people. Silas looked down for a moment. He had never imagined that ordinary choices, helping someone carry groceries, buying coats during a cold winter, fixing something without expecting thanks, would become bedtime stories for children he had never met. Marigold looked at Juniper with quiet curiosity. You told them all those stories? Juniper nodded. I never wanted them to believe kindness was rare. She smiled at the twins. Whenever they asked me, Are there really good people? I answered with one of Silas's stories. Silas looked surprised. You remembered all that? I remembered how people felt after meeting you. She looked at him. That mattered more than dates or places. Jessica smiled proudly. Mom always said heroes don't wear capes, Meadow added. They just keep showing up. Silas looked away. His eyes had become suspiciously bright. He wasn't used to hearing his life described that way. Most of the things he'd done had seemed ordinary. Small decisions, quiet moments. He had never expected them to become lessons someone carried into the next generation. Marigold smiled softly. They mattered more than you knew. Silas didn't trust himself to answer. Marigold looked toward the twins. So how did all that become? She laughed gently. Daddy? Jessica immediately covered her face. We were little. Meadow nodded enthusiastically. Really little. Jessica lowered her hands. Every bedtime story had Silas, Meadow continued. Every happy memory had Silas. Jessica smiled. And every lesson ended with. She looked at her mother. That's what Silas would have done. Juniper laughed softly. I may have said that once or twice. Jessica shook her head. More than once. A lot more. Meadow grinned. So we started thinking, Jessica continued. If every good story has Silas, then he must belong to our family. Silas couldn't stop himself from smiling. Juniper laughed through tears. I corrected them, Jessica answered immediately. Many times. Meadow giggled. But we didn't believe you. The room erupted into warm laughter. For the first time all evening, no one was carrying the weight of the past, not for those few precious seconds. Jessica slowly grew quiet again. We stopped believing you were our dad last year. Silas looked surprised. You did? She nodded. I found Mom crying. I asked why. She finally explained. Silas spoke gently. What did she tell you? Jessica smiled. That some people change your life, even if life doesn't let them stay. Silas couldn't find the words. Beneath the table, Marigold quietly reached for his hand. He squeezed hers gently. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. After a long silence, Silas finally asked, So why come here? Meadow answered before anyone else. We wanted to thank you. Silas looked puzzled. For what? Jessica smiled. If Mom hadn't met you, she said she never would have believed people could still be good. Silas lowered his eyes. For years, he had believed the story ended with loss. He had never imagined that somewhere else, without ever knowing, he had left behind something else entirely. Hope. Jessica reached into her backpack. She carefully pulled out another photograph. Not the old one, a newer picture. The twins stood proudly inside a cozy little bakery. Behind them, Juniper smiled from near the counter. Silas studied the picture. He was just about to ask where it had been taken when Juniper gently slid the photograph back toward Jessica. Another time, Silas looked at her curiously. He didn't ask why, but he wondered. A soft knock interrupted the room. The restaurant manager stepped inside. He looked uncomfortable. Miss Caleth, I'm sorry. There's a gentleman downstairs asking to see you. Juniper froze. Jessica lowered her eyes. Meadow quietly reached for her mother's hand. Silas noticed the change immediately. So, he asked gently, who is downstairs? Juniper didn't answer. She simply whispered, I hoped we'd have more time. The manager cleared his throat. He refused to leave. He said. The manager hesitated. He'll wait all night if he has to. Silas slowly stood. I'll go. Juniper immediately shook her head. No, you can't. Why not? Her voice was barely more than a whisper. Because if it's really him, everything is about to change again. The room fell silent after Juniper's warning. Silas looked from Juniper to the restaurant manager. Is he alone? I believe so. Juniper immediately stood. I'll go. Silas gently shook his head. No. This started because of me. It should be me. Juniper looked genuinely frightened. You don't understand. Then help me understand. I can't. Marigold quietly stood beside Silas. If someone has been waiting downstairs all night, we're not sending Juniper down there alone. Jessica tugged gently on Juniper's sleeve. Mom, please don't go. Juniper closed her eyes. For a moment she looked less like a woman in her 30s and more like someone carrying years of exhaustion. Silas spoke calmly. I'm only going to talk. If anything feels wrong, Juniper sat back. Juniper searched his face. Finally, she nodded once. Please be careful. Silas followed the restaurant manager through a quiet hallway toward the private elevator. Marigold caught up with him just before the doors opened. You didn't really think I'd let you go alone? He smiled faintly. I was hoping you would. Not a chance. The elevator doors closed. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Marigold broke the silence. Do you trust Juniper? Silas answered immediately. Yes, you didn't even hesitate. I know when someone is lying. And she isn't. Marigold nodded thoughtfully. I believe her too. Silas looked surprised. You do? I don't think she's hiding the truth. He frowned. You think she's hiding something else? Marigold smiled softly. There's a difference. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors slid open. The restaurant entrance buzzed with its usual evening crowd. Couples arrived hand in hand. Business executives laughed over late dinners. Tourists admired the sweeping view from the observation lounge. Nothing about the scene suggested anything unusual. Yet Silas felt it immediately. Someone was watching the entrance, waiting. Near one of the tall windows sat a man with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't reading. He wasn't pacing. He simply waited. The moment Silas stepped into the lobby, the man stood. He looked to be in his early 40s, broad shoulders, tired eyes, a face marked more by regret than anger. He looked first at Silas, then at Marigold. Finally, he offered a polite nod. Mr. Thornfield. Silas stopped a few feet away. I assume you're looking for Juniper. I am. Who are you? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the elevator behind Silas. Is she all right? Silas frowned. Answer my question first. The stranger accepted that. My name is Mitchell. Nothing more, no last name, no explanation. Silas waited. Mitchell sighed quietly. I don't suppose she's willing to see me. Silas studied him carefully. If she wanted to, she would have come herself. Mitchell lowered his eyes. I expected that. Silas folded his arms. What do you want from her? Mitchell answered without hesitation. To make sure she's safe. From what? I can't explain here. Try. Mitchell glanced toward nearby diners. This isn't the place. Silas didn't move. If it's important enough to interrupt her evening, it's important enough to tell me now. Mitchell gave a weary smile. You sound exactly like she described. Silas frowned. She talks about me. More than she realizes. Silas wasn't sure how to respond. Mitchell continued. I don't expect you to trust me. I don't. I only need you to listen. Silas remained silent. Mitchell reached into his jacket. Marigold instinctively stiffened. Mitchell noticed. Slowly, he removed only a small folded piece of paper. I was hoping she'd never need this. He held it toward Silas. I think she does now. Silas didn't take it. What is it? An address. What address? The only place I know she'll never think to look. Back in the private dining room, Jessica couldn't stop glancing toward the closed door. Meadow sat unusually quiet. Juniper kept twisting the ring on her finger, not because she wanted to wear it, because she always did when she was worried. Jessica noticed. Mom? Juniper smiled. I'm all right. Jessica wasn't convinced. You always say that. Juniper reached over and brushed a strand of hair away from Jessica's face. I know, Meadow whispered. Do you think he'll leave? Juniper didn't answer, because she honestly didn't know. Silas finally accepted the folded paper. He didn't open it. Not yet. You still haven't told me why you're here. Mitchell looked toward the elevator. I promised someone that if anything ever happened, I'd find Juniper. Silas narrowed his eyes. Who? Mitchell hesitated. For the first time since they'd met, he seemed genuinely uncertain. I can't tell you. Why not? Because it isn't my secret. Silas had heard enough. He slipped the paper into his pocket. If you really want to help, come upstairs. Mitchell's expression changed immediately. I don't think that's a good idea. You don't get to decide that. Silas turned toward the elevator. After a brief hesitation, Mitchell followed. No one spoke. The quiet hum of the elevator filled the space. Silas watched the numbers climb. Marigold studied Mitchell through the reflection in the mirrored wall. Mitchell kept both hands folded in front of him, almost like someone preparing to apologize, not defend himself. Silas noticed. It only made him more curious. The elevator doors opened. Silas stepped out first. Mitchell followed. The moment the private dining room door opened, Jessica looked up. Her face immediately changed. She stood so quickly her chair tipped backward. Meadow froze. Juniper slowly rose from her seat. No one spoke. Jessica whispered one word. Dad. Silas turned sharply toward Mitchell. Juniper closed her eyes. Marigold looked from one face to another. Nothing about the room suggested relief. Nothing suggested fear. Only unfinished history. Mitchell looked at his daughters. His voice was barely above a whisper. Hi, Peanut. Jessica didn't answer. He looked toward Meadow. You've gotten taller. Meadow's eyes filled with tears, but she stayed exactly where she was. Mitchell didn't try to hug them, didn't move closer, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply looked at Juniper. I know this is the last person you expected to see tonight. Juniper nodded slowly. You're right. Mitchell drew a careful breath. I wish I were here because of the girls. A long silence followed. Then he finished the sentence that changed everything. I'm here because someone else knows where you are. Mitchell stepped into the room. The door closed quietly behind him. No one welcomed him. No one invited him to sit. Jessica bent down and picked up the chair that had tipped over. She placed it back where it had been, without a word. Meadow slipped behind Juniper, holding tightly to the back of her mother's chair. Mitchell noticed. He noticed everything. The distance, the silence, the uncertainty in their eyes. He didn't force a smile. He didn't pretend everything was normal. Instead, he gave a small nod. I understand. No one answered. Silas watched him carefully. There was no charm, no performance, no attempt to win anyone over. Only a man who had walked into the room already expecting rejection. Juniper finally glanced toward the empty chair. You can sit. Mitchell hesitated, then quietly took the seat. It felt less like being invited, and more like being forgiven just enough to stay. For a few moments, no one spoke. Jessica studied him from across the table. "You look different." Mitchell smiled faintly. "I've got more gray hair." She shook her head. "No." Another pause. "You look sad." The words settled heavily over the room. Mitchell lowered his eyes. "I've missed a lot." Jessica answered with simple honesty. "Yes." Nothing more, nothing less. No anger, no comfort. Just the truth. Mitchell accepted it. "I missed birthdays." Jessica nodded. "You did." "I missed school plays." "You did." "I missed soccer games." "You did." Each answer landed gently, yet somehow hurt more than if she'd shouted. Mitchell drew a slow breath. "I used to tell myself I was doing it for all of you." Jessica looked at him quietly. "I know." "You do?" She nodded. "Mom never said you stopped loving us." Juniper looked toward Mitchell. "I never wanted them to believe that." Mitchell swallowed. "Thank you." Jessica folded her hands together. "But loving somebody," she searched for the right words, "isn't always the same as being there." Mitchell closed his eyes for a brief moment. "I know." No excuses followed. None were needed. Silas watched the exchange without interrupting. He had expected anger. Instead, he found honesty. Meadow peeked out from behind Juniper. She looked at Mitchell carefully, then asked in a small voice, "Do you still know the pancake song?" Mitchell looked surprised. A smile slowly appeared. "I think so." He cleared his throat dramatically, then began singing in the wonderfully ridiculous voice only children could truly appreciate. "Pancakes flipping high today, don't let breakfast run away." Meadow's eyes widened. Before he reached the second verse, she burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that arrived without permission. Jessica tried to stay serious. She lasted 3 seconds. Then she laughed too. Mitchell laughed with them. For just a little while, the years between them disappeared. Silas smiled quietly. It wasn't the song that mattered. It was the memory. Tiny moments often survived where bigger ones faded. A blanket fort, a silly breakfast song, a nickname. Sometimes love found its safest place inside ordinary things. The laughter slowly faded. But something had changed. Meadow was no longer hiding. Jessica no longer looked away every time Mitchell spoke. The room felt lighter, not healed, just a little less broken. Marigold had remained mostly silent. She watched everyone with thoughtful eyes. Finally, she turned toward Mitchell. "Why tonight?" He looked at her. "Because I ran out of time." The room grew still again. "What does that mean?" "I'll explain." He paused. "But first," he looked toward Jessica and Meadow. "I wanted my daughters to know I came back." Jessica frowned slightly. "Came back from where?" Mitchell smiled sadly. "That's part of the story." No one understood what he meant, yet something in his voice suggested those words carried far more weight than they appeared to. Silas finally spoke. "Were you a good husband?" Mitchell answered without hesitation. "No." The honesty surprised everyone. Silas asked another question. "Were you a good father?" Mitchell took longer this time. He looked toward Jessica, then Meadow. "I loved them." Silas nodded. "That wasn't my question." Mitchell lowered his eyes. "No." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, respectful. Mitchell hadn't tried to rewrite history. He hadn't searched for excuses. He had simply accepted responsibility. Silas found himself respecting that more than any carefully rehearsed explanation. Jessica quietly reached into her backpack. She pulled out a folded birthday card. The edges were worn. She slid it across the table. "It's yours." Mitchell looked confused. "You mailed it." "It came after my birthday." She smiled faintly. "I kept it anyway." Mitchell carefully picked up the card. His fingers trembled slightly. "I thought it never arrived." Jessica shrugged. "It did. I just didn't know what to say." Mitchell nodded. "I understand." He looked at the card for a long moment. "I kept every birthday drawing you ever mailed me." Jessica blinked. "You did?" "Every one." Neither of them had thrown away the reminders that the other still existed. Silas finally looked toward Mitchell. "So why are you really here?" Mitchell's expression became serious again. He looked briefly at Juniper, then back at Silas. "Because someone from her past has started asking questions again." He didn't say another word. Silas waited. Mitchell remained silent. Juniper suddenly stood. "No." Mitchell slowly nodded. "Yes." Silas looked between them. "What aren't you telling us?" Juniper closed her eyes. Mitchell spoke quietly. Tomorrow morning, he paused. Someone is coming for the bakery. Silas looked at Juniper after Mitchell's warning. Before we deal with tomorrow, I need to understand yesterday. Juniper didn't answer immediately. She looked toward Jessica and Meadow. They've heard pieces. Then she looked back at Silas. You deserve the whole story. Marigold quietly nodded. No interruptions, no assumptions, just the truth. Silas reached into his pocket and removed one of Juniper's unopened letters. He rested it gently on the table. I think this is where we start. The room became still. 7 years of silence were finally about to be broken. 7 years earlier, the future had seemed wonderfully simple. Silas had accepted a life-changing opportunity in New York. The plan was clear. He would leave first. Juniper would join him 2 weeks later after settling everything with her mother. The night before he left, they sat together on a worn wooden bench at the train station. Paper cups of coffee warmed their hands against the cool evening air. Silas smiled. 2 weeks. Juniper hooked her little finger around his. Don't make new friends before I get there. He laughed. I'll try. You'd better. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. When you step off that train, we'll start the rest of our lives. She rested her head against his shoulder. I can't wait. Back in the present, Silas's voice was barely above a whisper. I believed you. Juniper met his eyes. I meant every word. The following morning had begun exactly as they planned. Suitcases stood beside the front door. Train tickets rested on the kitchen table. A cup of coffee slowly grew cold. Then the phone rang. Juniper answered. A neighbor's frightened voice came through the receiver. Her mother had collapsed. Everything changed. The station disappeared from her thoughts. There was only the hospital. Doctors, tests, waiting rooms, unanswered questions. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Silas checked the clock again and again. Every passing hour made him glance toward the station timetable. He kept telling himself she would be on the next train. Back at the hospital, Juniper refused to stop hoping. She kept looking toward the time on the wall. If they stabilize her, I can still make it. Late that afternoon, the doctors finally managed to stabilize her mother. Juniper thanked them, grabbed her suitcase, and rushed toward the station. She still believed she could make the last train. Hope refused to let go. Rain began falling. Traffic slowed to a crawl. Then everything stopped. A delivery truck had jackknifed across a busy intersection. Cars stretched in every direction. Minutes disappeared. Juniper looked at the unmoving traffic, then made her decision. She climbed out of the car, grabbed her suitcase, and started running. The wheels bounced wildly across the wet pavement behind her. By the time she reached the station, she was soaked, breathless, exhausted. She ran onto the platform, just in time to see the final train pulling away. She ran after it anyway, calling Silas's name, though he was far beyond hearing her. Back in the private dining room, Silas slowly closed his eyes. I waited until midnight. Juniper nodded through tears. I got there 15 minutes too late. Neither of them searched for someone to blame. There wasn't anyone. Only 15 impossible minutes that had quietly changed 2 lives forever. Of return letters. You never stopped writing. Not once. Juniper shook her head. I kept believing the next one would reach you. Silas looked at the faded envelopes. 3 months after I arrived in New York, my company expanded. We moved offices, I moved apartments. My mailing address changed. He sighed quietly. The forwarding request eventually expired. Juniper stared at him. I never knew. He gently touched the ribbon. Request was sent back. Juniper smiled sadly. I thought every returned envelope was your answer. Silas shook his head. I never even knew you were trying. Silence settled over the room once more. There had been no betrayal, no lies, no broken promises, just timing, cruel, ordinary, unforgiving timing. Marigold quietly asked, When did each of you stop waiting? Silas answered first. Year 3. He looked down. I finally packed away the engagement ring. He smiled faintly. Not because I stopped loving her, because carrying hope every day had become too painful. Juniper nodded. I understand. She looked toward the window. I stopped 1 year later. I placed every photograph of Silas into a keepsake box. Jessica frowned. You hid them? Juniper smiled gently. Not to forget. To survive. Silas nodded slowly. Neither of them had walked away quickly. Both had held on far longer than anyone else had ever known. Jessica looked at Silas. So, nobody left? Silas smiled sadly. No. Meadow looked at Juniper. Nobody stopped loving each other? Juniper reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. No. Jessica sat quietly for several seconds. Then she spoke with the simple honesty only a child could manage. Then life made a very unfair decision. No one disagreed. For the first time in 7 years, Silas and Juniper finally understood the truth. Neither had abandoned the other. Neither had stopped caring. They had simply been separated by circumstances neither could control. The weight each had carried for years began, at last, to grow lighter. If this story has touched your heart so far, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a misunderstanding that changed the course of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime. Your support helps us continue bringing heartfelt stories like this one every week. Now, because the hardest part of their past is finally behind them, the greatest challenge waiting for them begins tomorrow morning. Mitchell quietly unfolded the property map he had brought with him. He slid it across the table towards Silas. Silas finally looked down. His eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped. In the center of the map, circled in bright red, was a small neighborhood bakery. Silas looked up. What is this? Mitchell's expression grew serious. It isn't just a bakery anymore. He tapped the map once. It's the reason someone has been searching for Juniper. Silas studied the property map Mitchell had placed on the table. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Several city blocks were outlined in blue. Almost every building carried a small checkmark beside it. Only one location remained circled in red, a tiny corner bakery. Silas looked up. This is Juniper's? Mitchell nodded. The last building that hasn't been sold. Jessica smiled proudly. I told you it was a good bakery. Meadow nodded. The cinnamon rolls are always gone before lunch. For a brief moment, everyone smiled. Then Mitchell quietly added, someone else wants it a lot more than customers do. The smiles faded. Juniper leaned back in her chair. The first offer came almost 3 years ago. Silas listened carefully. It was generous. More money than I'd ever imagined. Marigold tilted her head. So why didn't you sell? Juniper answered without hesitation. Because it wasn't just a business. She smiled softly. Jessica and Meadow exchanged knowing glances. It was where the girls learned to walk. It was where they decorated cookies every Christmas. It was where my mother's recipes stayed alive. Silas understood immediately. The bakery wasn't simply a building. It was memory, family, a life rebuilt one loaf of bread at a time. Juniper continued. When I declined, the offers kept coming. Each proposal was larger than the one before, each one harder to refuse. Her answer never changed. No, Silas finally asked. Who kept making them? Mitchell answered calmly. Richard Harlow. No dramatic pause, no elaborate introduction, just a name. Marigold frowned slightly. I know that company. Silas nodded. They're developing half the waterfront. Mitchell quietly replied, they want the entire block. Juniper unfolded another page from the property map. Every neighboring property had already been purchased. Old apartment buildings, a bookstore, a tailor, a florist, even the corner diner. Only the bakery remained. Silas looked back at the map. So if Juniper sells... Mitchell finished the sentence. Construction begins the next morning. Marigold folded her arms. If Richard wants the building that badly, why not simply wait? Juniper let out a small, humorless laugh. He tried patience first. She spoke without anger, only exhaustion. He never shouted. He never raised his voice. He never demanded anything. Silas listened closely. Instead, customers suddenly couldn't find parking. Suppliers canceled deliveries. Repair permits sat untouched for months. Insurance inspections happened every few weeks. Marigold frowned. Nothing illegal? Juniper slowly shook her head. Nothing obvious. Nothing I could prove. Silas nodded thoughtfully. He wasn't trying to scare you. Juniper met his eyes. He wanted me exhausted. So eventually, I'd decide selling was easier. Last month. And Richard made one fast. Juniper smiled. Richard bought him something. She looked toward Juniper. Can I tell him? Juniper nodded. Jessica grinned. She said, some things aren't for sale. Silas smiled. That sounds exactly like you. Juniper shrugged gently. I wasn't protecting bricks. I was protecting home. Marigold looked thoughtfully at Juniper. So tonight, you weren't only looking for Silas. Juniper shook her head. No. I came because I needed advice. Silas looked surprised. Mine? Juniper smiled. You've always been better at solving impossible problems than I was. Silas laughed quietly. I've failed at plenty. Maybe, she smiled back, but you've never stopped trying. Those words lingered in the room. Silas slowly closed the property map. He slid it toward Mitchell, then gently pushed it back. No. Mitchell looked puzzled. Silas smiled. I'm not giving this back. Everyone looked at him. He turned toward Juniper. You asked for advice. She nodded. I'm giving you more than advice. Silas carefully folded the map. I'm going to see this bakery. Juniper immediately shook her head. You don't have to. I know, but I want to. Mitchell studied him. You've never even been there. Silas smiled. No, but apparently, part of my life has been there for years. Jessica beamed. I'll show you the cookie jars, Meadow added, and my favorite table. Silas laughed. It's a date. For the first time that evening, hope felt possible again. Silas's phone vibrated across the table. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered, Silas Thornfield. Silence. Then a calm voice spoke. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Silas's expression changed. Who is this? The man answered politely. My name is Richard Harlow. The room became perfectly still. Richard continued in the same pleasant tone. I understand you've become interested in one of my business matters. Silas didn't answer. Richard chuckled softly. I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of it. The line went dead. Nobody spoke. Silas slowly lowered the phone, then looked at Juniper. He already knows I'm here. The following morning, the city felt different. Instead of steel towers, luxury hotels, private offices, Silas found himself driving through a quiet neighborhood where people actually knew each other's names. Jessica pointed excitedly through the windshield. There! A warm brick corner building came into view. Large front windows, fresh flowers lined the entrance. Children laughed as they walked out carrying cookies almost as big as their faces. Painted across the front window were the words, Juniper's Hearth Bakery. Silas smiled. So this is home. Juniper looked at the little building with quiet affection. It became one. Jessica insisted on giving the tour. This table is where Mom taught us homework. Meadow hurried toward a flower-covered counter. I learned to crack eggs there. An elderly customer looked up from his coffee and smiled. Morning, Juniper. Morning, Harold. Another customer waved. You're back. Jessica grinned at a woman near the display case. I'm practicing every day. The woman laughed. You'll win that spelling bee. Silas watched the conversations unfold. Nobody rushed. Nobody hurried through the door. Nobody spoke about pastries first. They asked about families, school, health, birthdays. Someone brought flowers for Juniper. Another customer handed Meadow a handmade bookmark. The bakery wasn't successful because of bread. It was successful because it felt like family. Silas leaned quietly toward Marigold. Now I understand. She smiled. So do I. Jessica disappeared up a narrow staircase. A minute later, she returned carrying a small wooden box. She looked at Juniper. Mom, can I show him? Juniper hesitated, then nodded. Jessica placed the box gently on the table. Silas lifted the lid. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, tiny handwritten notes, old receipts. At first he thought they were family keepsakes. Then he looked closer. A newspaper story about volunteers rebuilding a playground. A receipt with a note attached. Paid for a stranger's groceries. A photograph of neighbors planting trees together. Juniper smiled. They reminded me. Silas looked at her. Of what? That kindness never disappears. Jessica smiled proudly. Mom calls it the goodness box. Silas carefully turned another photograph over in his hands. None of the memories were about him. They were inspired by him. Every time Juniper witnessed an act of kindness, she saved it as proof that goodness still existed in the world. Silas quietly closed the box. He couldn't find the words. Mitchell unfolded the redevelopment plans across one of the bakery tables. For the first time, Silas saw the entire picture. Luxury apartments, boutique hotels, office towers, restaurants, green spaces, parking structures. Every neighboring property had already been purchased. Every permit had been approved. Every stage had been planned. Everything except one small bakery. Silas laughed softly. So one tiny oven stopped a $200 million project. Mitchell smiled. Pretty much. Juniper shrugged. I wasn't trying to stop anyone. I just didn't want to leave. A black luxury sedan quietly pulled up outside. Nobody panicked. Juniper simply sighed. He always arrives on time. Silas looked through the front window. A sharply dressed man stepped onto the sidewalk. Perfect suit, polished shoes, no bodyguards, no raised voice, no display of power. He calmly adjusted one cuff, looked toward the bakery, then walked inside. The bell above the door rang softly. Richard smiled pleasantly. "Good morning." Several customers smiled back. "Morning, Richard." He greeted people by name, asked one customer about her grandson, congratulated another on his retirement, then ordered 2 cinnamon rolls. He paid, thanked the cashier. Recognition flashed briefly across his face. "Mr. Thornfield." Silas nodded politely. "Mr. Harlow." Richard smiled. "I've admired your work." Silas answered evenly. "I've heard a little about yours." Jessica leaned toward Meadow. "They're smiling," Meadow whispered back. "But they don't mean it." Richard turned toward Juniper. "My offer still stands." Juniper smiled politely. "My answer does too. I increased it. I noticed. You could retire tomorrow. I don't want tomorrow." Richard studied her for a long moment. "You've always been difficult to persuade." Juniper smiled gently. "My grandmother called it loyalty." Silas hid a faint smile. Richard noticed. His expression never changed. Richard slowly looked toward Silas. "I hope you're simply visiting," Silas answered calmly. "I'm helping a friend." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Friendship is admirable." His eyes drifted around the bakery. So is knowing when to let go. Then he quietly turned, walked toward the door, opened it, and left. No threats, no insults, no raised voices. Only quiet confidence. That confidence unsettled Silas more than anger would have. Jessica suddenly hurried toward the front window. "Mom?" Everyone looked. Across the street, surveyors were placing bright orange stakes into the ground. Workers unloaded equipment from trucks. A construction supervisor began marking sections of the sidewalk with bright paint. Juniper's shoulders slowly fell. "They've started." Silas looked toward Mitchell. "What starts today?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached beneath the bakery door. An official notice had been slipped inside only moments earlier. He handed it to Silas. Silas unfolded the document. His expression changed. Marigold watched him carefully. "What is it?" Silas looked up. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "They're not asking Juniper to sell anymore." A long silence filled the bakery. Then he finished. "They're asking a judge to force her out." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. By mid-morning, people began arriving at the bakery. Not to protest, not to argue, simply to buy bread, coffee, cookies. One customer said, "If this place is in trouble, I figured I'd have breakfast here." Another smiled. "I came for pie." An elderly woman laughed. "I came because this is where my husband proposed to me 32 years ago." Soon every table was occupied. The line stretched out the door. Silas quietly watched. "This isn't a business." Marigold smiled. "It's a piece of the neighborhood." Juniper wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Jessica began recognizing faces. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street, Coach Henderson, the librarian who always saved mystery books for Meadow, the crossing guard who knew every child's name. Each person shared a memory connected to the bakery: birthday cakes, first jobs, school fundraisers, free soup during winter storms. Silas realized something important. Richard bought buildings. Juniper built relationships. One lasts much longer than the other. A delivery truck pulled into the alley behind the bakery. Mitchell climbed out carrying bags of flour. Jessica looked confused. "You bake now?" Mitchell laughed. "Not unless everyone enjoys burnt bread." He explained he had spent the morning calling every supplier Richard had tried to pressure into leaving. One by one, they agreed to come back, not because of contracts, because they respected Juniper. Mitchell spent hours driving across the city collecting every delivery himself. Jessica watched quietly. For the first time, she saw effort instead of promises. Silas noticed Marigold helping customers without being asked, refilling coffee, cleaning tables, carrying trays. No one knew she was engaged to one of the wealthiest men in New York. No one cared. An elderly customer smiled. "You've worked here long?" Marigold laughed. "About 40 to 5 minutes." The woman patted her hand. "You're a natural." Silas smiled from across the room. Juniper noticed. She walked beside him. "You chose well." Silas looked toward Marigold. "I know." While helping organize old bakery records, Meadow accidentally knocked over a dusty storage box. Receipts scattered across the floor. Jessica began gathering them. Silas knelt to help. One receipt caught his eye. Attached to it was a handwritten agreement signed years earlier by the previous owner of the property. Mitchell leaned closer. This was never included in the redevelopment files. Juniper frowned. What is it? Silas read carefully. The document granted permanent public access through the bakery to a small historical courtyard protected under the city's preservation rules. Without that access, the entire redevelopment plan violated municipal regulations. Silence filled the room. Marigold looked at Silas. This changes everything. The bell above the bakery door rang. Richard stepped inside once more, calm as ever. He noticed the crowded shop, the smiling customers, the volunteers. Then he noticed the document in Silas's hand for the first time. His smile faltered, only for a second. You found it. Silas folded the paper. I wasn't looking. Richard nodded slowly. No. I suppose you weren't, Richard quietly asked. What do you want? Silas answered. Nothing. Richard raised an eyebrow. Then why involve yourself? Silas looked around the bakery. Because some places shouldn't disappear simply because someone powerful wants the land. Richard studied him for several seconds, then quietly laughed. I underestimated you. Silas smiled. No, you underestimated everyone in this room. Richard looked at the customers filling every table. He finally understood. This fight was never about one building, it was about a community. Richard left without another word. The room slowly relaxed. Jessica walked toward Mitchell. He immediately knelt so they were eye level. She studied him for a long moment, then quietly asked, Are you staying this time? Mitchell's answer came without hesitation. Yes. No matter what. No matter what. Jessica nodded once, then wrapped her arms around him. Mitchell closed his eyes. He didn't cry loudly. One silent tear said enough. That evening, the bakery finally grew quiet. Customers headed home. The neighborhood returned to normal. Silas stood outside watching the lights glow through the bakery windows. Marigold joined him. You've been thinking. I have. About Richard? Silas smiled. No, about us. Marigold looked at him. Silas reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The same velvet ring box, still unopened since the rooftop restaurant. He turned it over in his hands. I don't think the perfect proposal exists. Marigold smiled warmly. I don't either. Silas laughed softly. Good, because I think ours is about to become wonderfully imperfect. 3 evenings later, the rooftop restaurant welcomed Silas and Marigold once again, not because they were trying to recreate the past, because unfinished moments deserved a proper ending. The restaurant manager recognized them immediately. I've been hoping you'd come back, Silas smiled. So have I. This time there were no cameras, no curious guests, no grand arrangements, just 2 people sitting across from each other, finally able to breathe. Marigold looked out across the Manhattan skyline. It feels different. Silas smiled. It is. So are we. Dinner arrived. Neither of them rushed. Silas reached across the table. I'm sorry. Marigold tilted her head. For what? For asking you to share a night that became someone else's story. She gently squeezed his hand. It became ours too. Silas looked surprised. I watched you choose honesty. I watched you choose kindness. I watched you stand beside people who needed you. She smiled warmly. I've never been more certain about us. Silas laughed softly. I spent weeks planning a perfect proposal, and life ignored every plan. Marigold smiled. I'm glad. He looked puzzled. The perfect version would have lasted 1 evening. She looked toward the city lights. This version will stay with us forever. Earlier that afternoon, Juniper locked the bakery for the night. Mitchell helped sweep the floors. Jessica counted tomorrow's cookie orders. Meadow carefully arranged fresh flowers by the front window. Juniper paused before turning off the lights. She looked around the room. Every wall held memories, not of loss, of survival. Mitchell quietly walked beside her. You all right? She smiled. For the first time in years. I think I am. She looked toward him. We'll never have the marriage we hoped for. He nodded. I know, but I think we can still give the girls something beautiful. Mitchell smiled. A family that tells the truth. Juniper nodded. Exactly. The next morning, Jessica woke to the smell of pancakes. She walked into the kitchen. Mitchell stood at the stove, wearing an apron that clearly belonged to Juniper. Flour dusted the front of his shirt. Meadow burst into laughter. You burned the first batch. Mitchell sighed dramatically. They sacrificed themselves for science. Jessica laughed. The sound surprised everyone, especially Mitchell. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It was something better. A beginning. Back on the rooftop, Silas reached into his jacket. Marigold smiled immediately. I was wondering when you'd stop pretending. He laughed. I wasn't pretending. You touched that pocket 6 times tonight. I did not. You absolutely did. They laughed together. Silas removed the same velvet ring box, only now his hands weren't shaking from fear. They were steady, because this wasn't about perfection anymore. He opened the box. Marigold Brandon, I can't promise a life without surprises. I can't promise every plan will work. I can't promise we'll never have difficult days. He smiled. But I can promise. You'll never face them alone. He stood, not because tradition said he should, because he wanted to look directly into her eyes. Will you marry me? Marigold didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood too, placed both hands around his, then said through happy tears, I thought you'd never ask. Silas laughed. So, is that a yes? She kissed him. I thought that part was obvious. The restaurant filled with warm applause, not loud, not overwhelming, just enough to celebrate 2 people whose love had been tested before it had even begun. As they prepared to leave, Silas's phone vibrated. A photo arrived. Jessica, Meadow, Juniper, Mitchell, standing outside the bakery beneath the evening lights. Below the picture was one simple message from Juniper. Thank you for reminding all of us that losing time doesn't always mean losing family. Silas smiled quietly. Marigold read it too. Neither said a word. Some messages didn't need an answer. Driving home through the city, Marigold rested her head lightly against Silas's shoulder while they waited at a red light. What are you thinking? He smiled. That life has a strange sense of timing. She laughed softly. You still believe everything happens for a reason? He considered the question. No. I think people give reasons to what happens. Marigold nodded. I like that better. A week later, Silas and Marigold stopped by the bakery. Not because anyone had invited them, because they wanted fresh bread. Jessica raced toward the door. Meadow followed close behind. Mitchell was frosting cupcakes. Juniper was laughing at something he had clearly done wrong. The bakery felt lighter, alive, exactly as it should. Jessica quietly slipped her hand into Silas's. Can I ask you something? Always, she smiled. Not now. At the wedding, Silas looked puzzled. What are you planning? Jessica grinned mischievously. You'll see, Silas laughed. I suddenly feel nervous. Marigold smiled. You should. 6 months later, sunlight poured through the windows of a small country chapel just outside New York. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. Just fresh flowers, wooden pews, friends, family, the kind of wedding built around people instead of appearances. Silas waited near the front. His hands were folded. Not from nerves this time, from gratitude. Mitchell quietly walked over. You all right? Silas smiled. I've never been better. Mitchell laughed. You don't look convinced. I don't think anyone ever feels completely ready. Mitchell nodded knowingly. I don't think we're supposed to. The music began. Everyone stood. The chapel doors slowly opened. Jessica and Meadow appeared first, matching cream-colored dresses, tiny baskets filled with white flower petals. Jessica whispered, Ready? Meadow nodded excitedly. Together, they began walking down the aisle. Silas watched them. A memory flashed through his mind. The rooftop restaurant. 2 little girls running toward him. Daddy! He smiled to himself. Life had a remarkable way of rewriting its own stories. Jessica noticed him smiling. She smiled back. This time, neither of them was confused. Marigold appeared, simple dress, no dramatic entrance, no orchestra, just quiet happiness. Silas forgot everyone else existed. She reached him, softly asked, You still nervous? He laughed, a little. She squeezed his hand. So am I. The ceremony began. Not with perfection, with peace. Juniper sat beside Mitchell. Not as husband and wife, not as strangers, as parents. Jessica quietly slipped her hands into both of theirs, one hand holding her mother's, the other holding her father's. Neither adult said anything. They didn't need to. Some promises were made without words. Juniper smiled. Mitchell smiled back. Not because the past disappeared, because they finally stopped fighting it. After the ceremony, guests gathered outside beneath old oak trees. Jessica reached into her little purse. She pulled out the same faded photograph she had carried into the restaurant months earlier. She handed it to Silas. "This belongs to you." Silas studied it carefully. The younger version of himself, Juniper beside him, two people who believed tomorrow was guaranteed. He smiled and gently handed it back. "No, I think it belongs to all of us now." Juniper quietly placed it inside a new family album, not hidden away, not forgotten, simply accepted as part of their story. Jessica walked over to Silas. "So, I have something to ask." Silas knelt. "What is it?" She smiled. "When Meadow and I first met you, we called you Dad." Silas laughed softly. "You certainly surprised me." Jessica nodded. "We know you aren't." Silas smiled warmly. "I know." Meadow stepped beside her sister. She looked up at Silas. "Then, what should we call you?" Silas thought for a second. "Silas is perfectly fine." Jessica immediately shook her head. "No, that's too ordinary." Meadow grinned. "We voted." Silas laughed. "You voted?" Both girls nodded proudly. Jessica smiled. "We've decided." "You voted." Silas began to glisten. "I'd be honored." The girls threw their arms around him. This time, no misunderstanding, only love. Later that afternoon, children laughed across the chapel lawn. Fresh bread from Juniper's Hearth Bakery disappeared almost as quickly as it was served. Mitchell helped clear tables without being asked. Marigold caught Silas watching Jessica and Meadow chase butterflies through the grass. "What are you smiling about?" Silas slipped his hand into hers. "I spent years believing I lost my future." He watched the girls laugh together. Turns out, life wasn't taking something away. It was quietly making room for something different. Marigold leaned against his shoulder. "And was it worth the wait?" Silas smiled, without hesitation. "Every single day." Jessica looked back across the lawn and waved. "Bye, Uncle Silas," Meadow echoed happily. "See you tomorrow." Silas raised his hand and smiled. The first time they ran toward him, they were searching for a father. Now, they were running toward family. The end. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Do you think Silas made the right choice by marrying Marigold, or would you have chosen differently? If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime, and share this story with someone who believes family is built by love, not just by blood. We'll see you in the next story.